Wow. Wow, that is a Melbourne welcome. And I can tell you what a thrill it is to be here and what a marvelous city you have. You know it. But for me, arriving here and haven't been here for a number of years, it is just a sparkling, beautiful, exciting, vibrant, walkable city, and with so many wonderful and committed people. And really thank you for that. And it's been extremely entertaining couple of days here also. A lot of street festivals of young people trying to be heard in your active democratic process. And I really applaud the students for what they're doing and for the message that they're conveying. I think that what's happening this week in Australia is extremely important, and I am confident that it's going to produce some very important results for this wonderful country. It's really a tremendous pleasure and opportunity for me to be able to share some thoughts with you about the importance of the coming year and a half in shaping what will be decades to come. We're at a moment of tremendous importance in global diplomacy. One might not know it, given the pressing local debates and concerns in any part of the world, but we need to get things right in global cooperation in a short period of time. We've assigned ourselves certain tasks over the period until the end of 2015. It's a short period, and the agenda could not be more important. And that's what I'll share with you this evening, some thoughts about how we successfully navigate an extremely complicated global discussion and debate that engages all parts of the world in facing both shared problems and extremely varied problems as well. But the time is short and the stakes are very high. I think, now I don't know where I'm supposed to point this. Someplace. Where are you, computer? Back. No. We'll get there. It worked a moment ago, actually, but it doesn't work now. Oh, okay. President John F. Kennedy, I think, put the stakes that we face as vividly as anybody that I can think of when in his inaugural address he made this remarkable statement: "For we hold in our mortal hands the ability to end all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." And I do take that as really the defining reality of our age. President Kennedy was speaking in early 1961, and of course he was referring to the risk of nuclear war at the time. And he couldn't have known, though obviously he sensed it, that within less than 2 years we would come within just that thinnest of thin margins imaginable to complete global destruction in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Today we can take that statement also as a true signal of our time and a true message of our reality. We aren't pressed quite as much by the risk of nuclear war, though we are indeed pressed by it, and we should never forget, especially as we approach the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I in just a few weeks, how accidents and bad will and miscalculation and stupidity can take us very far, much farther than we can imagine on a path of destruction. But today we think of this capacity to do both great and wonderful things in fighting poverty, but also highly destructive things more in the environmental sense. Because gradually, all too gradually, we've come to understand over the past 4 decades just how much threat humanity is posing to our own survival and the well-being of future generations through our effects on the planet. And we really are at a crossroads now, much more than I think psychologically we really can be prepared, because this is something new. It's something new for our time. It's something unique for this generation. And obviously it's something new in a way that has not reached the halls of power, whether in Canberra or in Washington or in Brussels or in other parts of the world. President Kennedy's sense of this paradox of modern times is really the most pressing reality that we face. So I would define our condition, the special features of our generation, in the following way. First, while globalization has been with us at least for the last 100,000 years, and the Aboriginal populations reached this continent perhaps 70,000 years ago, meaning that global migration and trade has been the essence of our species from the very beginning. We do face a new condition just within the last 25 years of the extraordinarily tight integration of production, trade, financial, and technological systems at a global scale. I was at BHP Billiton just a few hours ago discussing with the senior management there some of these issues, and you think about a company like that, one of the world's largest, that is engaged in probably about 160 or 170 countries, a major multinational company like that, and like so many others, typically has hundreds of thousands of employees, works in almost every country of the world, and generally runs circles around our foreign ministries and state departments in their capacity to act globally. This is a relatively new phenomenon, in fact, and of course it has made these companies more powerful than our governments, more effective at the global arrangements. It's a reality that we have to understand as we try to shape an effective response to some of our challenges. Second, of course, we're in a most wondrous and dramatic scientific and technological revolution. The digital and communications revolutions made possible by advances in solid-state physics and in computational sciences, and I'll talk about that shortly. This gives us incredible capacity to solve problems and to connect the world in ways that were literally unimaginable or unimagined just 5 or 10 years ago. We are still in the midst of massive demographic change. We are now as crowded as could be imagined, 7.2 billion people on the planet, when Thomas Robert Malthus, a name you know, who warned about overpopulation, wrote his famous essay on the principles of population in 1798. There were 900 million people on the planet. We've had an 8-fold increase of population since then, and it's not over. While the proportionate growth of the population has slowed from a peak of around 2.1% per year in the early 1970s, the absolute increase of global population has remained almost unchanged now for nearly half-century at about 75 million net population increase per year. We're now growing at about 1.1% population increase globally on a 7.2 billion base. and that is the same absolute increase of twice that growth rate at half the population back in 1972. And so this is a stark shaper of our reality. We're at 7.2 billion people now, and the most recent UN population forecast of the medium fertility variant, which takes the kind of moderate best guess of population dynamics on current trajectory, puts the world population at 8 billion in the year 2024 and at 9 billion in 2041 and 10 billion by around 2080 and 10.5 to 11 billion by the end of this century. Almost all of this growth in low-income countries, because that's where the fertility rates remain the highest. This is a fundamental shaper for the world in the years ahead, and I'll describe some of that shortly. We're obviously in unprecedented geopolitical upheaval as well. The American century, so-called, proclaimed by Luce of Time magazine in the mid-1940s, lasted roughly till the end of the 20th century. We are now, we've already entered a new geopolitical age with the rise of China and more generally the rise of many regional powers. And by some accounts, as I'm sure you read last week in some news stories, China may already have overtaken the U.S. economy to become the #1 largest economy in the world already this year. It all depends on what price indices one uses to measure national income. But if it's not this year, it will be next year or 5 years or 10 years. What we have is a very basic transition in global reality. For 2.5 centuries, what we call the West, which is it is an odd term for a sphere, for a globe, but in any event, what we call the West, meaning really the North Atlantic, has been the dominant geopolitical force, and that's already come to an end. And it's already reshaping global dynamics. It opens up new risks. It also opens up new possibilities. It also defines our age. And finally, our reality, of course, is that we're wholly in the midst of massive environmental upheaval. And that is the reality that really brings us to the age of sustainable development. So the good news is that the scientific and technological revolutions that have powered all of modern economic growth for the last 2 centuries plus, really since, one could even say 3 centuries, since John Newcomen in around 1712 invented the first steam engine and started the Industrial Revolution. We've had wave after wave of technological advance that has wholly transformed the planet. And in our age, this greatest advance, of course, is in information technology. That's a whole complex of scientific and technological pursuits that basically rely on the fact that all organized information of any kind can be defined as a sequence of zeros and ones, something that a great genius, Alan Turing, realized in the 1930s and was able to put into operation in the 1940s with the first computers, and then which other great scientists were able to realize with the semiconductors and understanding that semiconductors could make logical gates, and then with the advance to putting multiple semiconductors, multiple transistors onto a single integrated circuit in the late 1950s to create the idea of microprocessors transforming the whole world economy. And as you know, the great defining principle of that digital revolution is Moore's Law, the idea that the then president of Intel in 1965 enunciated when he looked back at the 8-year history of the integrated circuit. And he said, this is pretty interesting. Every 18 to 24 months, we've been doubling the number of transistors that can be put onto this circuit. And there had been 5 doublings by the time that Gordon Moore wrote his paper in 1965, and 2 to the 5th is a 32-time increase of the capacity of these microprocessors. And Gordon Moore famously predicted that this headroom of doubling every 18 to 24 months would continue for another 10 years. That was 1965, and we basically had another half century of the continuation of this doubling. This has been about 30 doublings since the start of integrated circuits. And if you take out your calculator and calculate 2 to the 30th, which you can do on your handheld calculator precisely because of Moore's Law, you will find out that this is more than a billion-fold increase in the capacity to store, process, and transmit data. And this graph exemplifies what Intel has been up to, not from the very beginning, but from 1971, when the chip that in the first early computers, Intel 4004 had 2,300 transistors on it, to the most recent chip with 5 billion transistors on it. This is the great transformation in our time that has changed the whole world economy. It has made globalization in that intensive sense possible. It's changed communications, transport, logistics, computer design, and now every area of scientific pursuit as well. It has made possible another curve that looks almost the same. This is the curve of mobile phone subscribers. Back in 1980, there were about 20,000 mobile phones. And I remember, I don't know if you remember, the first time you saw a mobile phone, for those of us a little bit older than the median age here, that was an incredible thing. And I remember I was actually on an airplane, and a guy had a big box on his lap. And I said, "What's that?" And he lifted off the top of the box, and there was a phone there in this big box. And I said, "Oh my God, you're carrying a phone booth. That is the most amazing thing in the world." And it was the most amazing thing in the world. I could not get my head around the fact that you could have a portable phone booth on your lap. And in fact, it was the beginning of an absolutely stupendous revolution. There are now 7 billion subscribers. And I can tell you, based on my experiences every 2 or 3 months of going to remote villages in very poor parts of Africa and other very poor parts of the world, now there are no places that are not connected. Even 5 or 10 years ago, it was easy to find villages where no one had ever made a phone call in their life, and there was still no coverage. Now you can't find that. Any peasant farmer anywhere typically has a phone in her hand or his hand, even out in the field. This is such a valuable, remarkable technology. And of course, it has made possible, as I've been noting in recent days, what I regard as the apex of civilization, the ultimate technological achievement. We can stream movies on our phone. Can you imagine? We have basically solved and unlocked all of the universe's essential problems through Netflix, which I understand is coming to Australia or maybe it's here, but I saw something about new entry into the market here. But it's actually possible to use this technology even for lesser goods than streaming movies on phones. This is, I think, a notable example and very pertinent for the message that I want to convey this evening. The digital revolution is, of course, penetrating every single area of science and every sector of the economy: health, education, finance, of course, entertainment, and energy systems, and countless others. Back in 2001, because of the information revolution, making it possible to sequence the human genome, which is 3,000 base pairs and requires massive information processing in order to be able to sequence the genome. The first genomes were sequenced. The cost of doing that was about $100 million at the time. And the National Institutes of Health of the United States called together an expert group to think blue sky about what should be done with this remarkable new scientific know-how. And the conclusion that was reached in that group was that a goal should be pursued to reduce the cost of genomic sequencing down to $1,000 per human genome, because that would make it a tool for practical medicine as well as massively for research. And NIH took up the challenge, made a major grant system, all organized around promoting the dramatic reduction of cost of human genome sequencing. And since this is a semi-logarithmic scale where time is on the horizontal axis and the costs going from 1,000 up to 100 million are on the vertical axis in equal proportionate steps, a straight downward line signifies a constant proportional reduction year by year. That white line is Moore's law. It's a halving of the costs every 2 years. You can see that the actual progression of reducing the human genome sequencing cost has been a super Moore's law. It's come down by 100,000-fold in 12 years. And indeed, the goal of achieving the $1,000 human genome is achieved this year. And this is a tremendous example of what we can do with a targeted effort aimed at solving a problem by mobilizing this remarkable technology that we have at human disposal now. And we know that such advances are taking place across many fields of vital interest. This is a somewhat slower progression, so-called Swanson's law, which holds that the cost of photovoltaic cells drops by about 20% for every doubling in cumulative installation. That's a kind of learning curve that's characteristic of industrial processes. In 1977, the cost of 1 watt of solar power was $77. By today, and heavily thanks to China with its massive deployment and industrial production, the cost has come down 100-fold, that is to 1/100th of the cost in 1977 to about 77 cents per watt. This is what makes it possible very realistically to envision universal access to modern electricity, covering the roughly 1.4 billion people in the world that do not have access, and many of whom are very far from a power grid. And this offers clean, off-grid or microgrid access. We've come within reach of realizing the goal of clean, safe, modern electricity. And by the way, I'm sure you know it, but that is no small deal. Electricity is not a luxury. It is absolutely a necessity for achieving safety, clean water, safe food, cold chains for vaccines, the ability to have safe delivery, in childbirth, everything else that we need, productivity for farmers with solar-powered irrigation pumps and the rest, there is no such thing as economic development without electricity. And now it is within reach because of this dramatic technological advance. And the implications of this revolution, when harnessed with good governance and proper development strategies, is truly a remarkable decline of global poverty. President Kennedy was right, and he was visionary when he said we hold in our mortal hands the ability to end all forms of human poverty. It's literally correct. The World Bank keeps the formal data, not, in my opinion, in the most adequate sense of the measurement of this, but they keep the data of households below a minimum income level, which is the threshold for defining extreme poverty. Back in 1990, if you take the developing countries as a whole, and that's roughly 6/7 of the world's population, about 6 billion of the 7.2 billion people on the planet, the estimate is that about 43% of the households live below the famed $1.25 per person per day extreme poverty line. By 2010, that rate had declined from 43% to just 21%. Millennium Development Goal 1 has actually been achieved, taking the developing countries in the aggregate, that extreme poverty has come down by more than half. It is notable, by the way, and something we need to fix, that 2010 is the most recent year of data that I can provide you with, because the lag in collection is so long, it's absolutely shocking. I'm quite sure that Google could tell us hour by hour the world poverty rate. The World Bank lags by about 4 years. We have to fix this going forward so we have reliable data and we know where we're going on a timely basis. But the likelihood is that we've declined from about 21% probably down to 18% or 17% extreme poverty. And it's notable that the World Bank Development Committee, which is the policy board of the World Bank, adopted formally last year the goal of ending extreme poverty by this metric by the year 2030. And next year, when the world adopts the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG number 1 will certainly be the goal of ending extreme poverty. So this is the reflection of the high potential of globalization, the wonderful returns to scientific and technical knowledge properly harnessed. Now I have to tell you, that's the end of the good news of the lecture. Because remember, President Kennedy said we hold in our hands the ability to end all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life, and we have to consider the converse of all this good news. And there's a lot of worrisome news. And we have to understand that we can't be blithely believing that all problems will be solved by technology, because technology always cuts in both directions. Just as it did with nuclear power, it does with the technology and the know-how that we have. The fact of the matter is, to start with, technology is leading to upheavals in labor markets all over the world. Old jobs are gone. The whole proposition of where employment and income and decent work is created is changing dramatically before our eyes. Globalization, of course, has shifted the global location of work, but it also, with robotics and advanced information systems and artificial intelligence, is tremendously transforming work and eliminating many, many of the usual pathways to middle-class life. In the United States, manufacturing employment has declined from about 20 million people at the end of the 1970s to around 11.5, 12 million today. those jobs are never coming back. And by the way, the idea that somehow the hydrofracking and all the rest is going to bring back massive numbers of jobs in manufacturing is foolhardy. It's from people who don't know how to look at data or labor markets. These jobs are not coming back. They've been transformed fundamentally. And this is leading, as one of the factors, to a massive increase of inequality in many societies. Young people without the skills can't find a foothold in today's economy. And some with skills don't have skills that fit well into the skills that are being demanded in the marketplace. And so what I'm showing you here is this remarkable rise in inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient in the United States. We've reached the highest level of inequality in American history. Now, mind you, it's not only technology and market forces, it's also a lot of politics, because the rich own the political system and drive it through tax policies and other policies to amplify their wealth. And this is part of the vicious circle that we're in the United States and in many other countries right now. But it is a stark reality. And it leads to this kind of reality all over the world. Now, today was calm and nice in Melbourne, but students are out on the streets, fortunately not like these pictures, but they are protesting similar kinds of attitudes, neglect of real long-term interests, a kind of selfishness of politics that is widespread in the world right now. And I have seen in cities all over the world, I for a while was taking it personally that every place I landed, there were protests out on the street. I'm not going to count Melbourne in this way. But the fact of the matter is that there is unrest all over the world. There's no question about it. And young people are feeling aggrieved for understandable reasons. Their ability to find a foothold in today's economy and today's society is up for grabs. And the result is that the crisis of governance, the crisis of fairness, the crisis of inclusion or exclusion is a dominant reality now. I very much like what Pope Francis said and wrote, I should say, in his Evangelii Gaudium exhortation last fall, where he talked about the globalization of indifference as being a phenomenon of globalization itself, that we have this great potential to solve problems, and yet at the same time there is a kind of indifference to solving them, a deadening of the moral impulse in many places, especially at the top of society, that has to be overcome. Now, that's only one of the two great challenges that need to be faced in an age of sustainable development. The second is the reality that our economic success is also potentially the bane of our very existence. If you take a long view of economic development and economic growth, it's very helpful to understand how unusual our time really is. It all did start with the Industrial Revolution. For 2,000 years before that, world output was essentially unchanging. And now with 5 great waves of technological change, since the steam engine, since the era of rail and telegraph, modern chemistry, the automobile age, and now the information age, the dramatic surge of global output and global population has led to a rise of total economic output in the world that is probably around 250 to 300 times the scale of economic activity back at the time of James Watt or Adam Smith or Thomas Robert Malthus at the end of the 18th century. We've had an explosion of economic activity. That's the modern world. And it shows in this graph historically, just like Moore's Law, or just like mobile phone subscriptions, that we're living in a unique moment. And the result of all of that is that we are putting, in this generation, at this time, unprecedented pressures on the physical earth of a scale that was literally unimaginable even a generation ago. I'm a big believer that every generation faces its special challenges. And I don't want to say we're the only generation to face great challenges, because every generation since the beginning of modern economic growth has faced a fundamental transformation in the nature of life, the nature of politics, the nature of work, the nature of social relations. We're not alone in that by any means. But what I do believe is unique for our time is the environmental crisis. Now, mind you, environmental crises have been part of human history, again, for tens of thousands of years. But the idea that humanity could create a global scale crisis is only a present reality. It was foreshadowed 42 years ago at the first global summit in Stockholm at the UN Conference on Environment and Development, and it was foreshadowed in that path-breaking Club of Rome book, Limits to Growth, in 1972. And it was part and parcel of the critical global negotiation at the Earth Summit 22 years ago. But the reality has now reached us. The warning time is over. We're now in the thick of it. And planetary boundaries is one of the two great concepts that helps us to understand this unique reality of our time. The other concept is the concept of Paul Crutzen, one of the Nobel laureate chemists who helped discover the ozone depletion effect and head off the worst, when Crutzen coined and popularized the concept of the Anthropocene, the other word I'd like everybody to know and to use and to share. The Anthropocene is a neologism, a new phrase from the Greek anthropos, meaning human, and scene, meaning epoch of the earth. So it means that humanity is now the creator of the new geologic epoch. And that's extraordinary that one species, ours, is now the shaper of the physical earth, to such an extent that we're actually endangering the survival of millions of species, not to mention our own. Now, the planetary boundary concept, which is the work of several dozen world-leading ecologists, helps us to understand the dimensions of this crisis. And I very much like this circle, and I won't go into excruciating detail except to say that at high noon is climate change. This is the #1 greatest threat to our well-being and to the functioning of the planet. And we have already put the world into a state that is unprecedented in the whole period of civilization, which is the last 10,000 years, the so-called Holocene. And we have a lot more to come, as I'll state in a moment. If you go around the circle, at 1 to 2 o'clock is ocean acidification, which occurs as the carbon dioxide loading in the atmosphere dissolves into the ocean surface water, creating carbonic acid and threatening the whole range of calcareous species, those with exoskeletons, mollusks, diatoms that have calcium shells, and of course the corals. And Australia is home to the greatest of the coral reefs, and it's under profound threat, as you know very well, and in part because of this ocean acidification. Ozone depletion, massive fluxes of nitrogen and phosphorus, depletion of fresh water, destruction of habitat through land use change, biodiversity loss at a scale now called the 6th great extinction phase of our planet, massive aerosol loadings leading to massive heart and lung disease, and massive chemical pollutants. These are the planetary boundaries that we are threatening and reaching thresholds of profound danger. The most important of which, climate change, is driven most importantly by carbon dioxide emissions, as you know, through the burning of coal, oil, and gas. Coal is phenomenal. It made the modern world. There should be no doubt about it. It was James Watt harnessing coal and the modern steam engine that made possible the entire Industrial Revolution. But there's just one damn thing, the side effect, which we absolutely now face head on. This idea, by the way, that has not yet reached Canberra, that CO2 affects the climate, was first hypothesized by Joseph Fourier, not in 2006 Climate Change Journal, but in 1824. And then Tyndall added considerable science in the 1840s to how this would work. And I'd like to point out that the first precise scientific publication of what a doubling of CO2 would mean for the Earth's temperature was published in 1896 by Svante Arrhenius, a true genius Nobel laureate chemist in Sweden. This is not new science. This is deeply established science. It's established for well over 120 years. The precise questions are indeed fascinating because the basics of the heat flux and solar radiation and black body radiation and the greenhouse effect that determine how carbon dioxide affects climate have been known now for more than a century. The precise details of ocean atmospheric circulation, the dynamics of dissipation of heat into the ocean, ocean circulation, and so forth. These are real questions without doubt. But the basics are not open to question, or not open to question any more than all of our scientific inquiry is open to question. We know that we're on an extraordinarily dangerous path. And what this curve shows you is the estimates of carbon dioxide loading in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. And throughout that whole ancient period, you get ups and downs of CO2 that are driven by changes of the Earth's orbit. This is also understood during the last half century. And those CO2 changes, in turn, drive massive changes of temperature and massive changes of sea level because high CO2 leads to warming that melts the ice sheets and that raises the sea level. And we have an exquisitely reconstructed paleoclimate record which verifies all of this. And the fact of the matter is that every time CO2 has been at the level that it's at right now, sea level has been several meters higher than it is today. My colleague, Dr. James Hansen, one of the world's great climate scientists, points out that that means that when the feedback effects of what we've already done are fully worked out, we have already committed a massive increase of sea levels and other kinds of extraordinarily dangerous and deleterious change. As Professor Hansen says, we've already left the Holocene environment. Now, you look at this graph, you can notice something odd happened in the last sliver of the graph. Instead of CO2 following the normal pattern of being between 150 parts per million and 250 parts per million, the line just shoots straight up. For that, you can thank James Watt and BHP and others, because now we harness massive amounts of fossil fuels. They have made the modern economy, and they have pushed CO2 into a level not seen for the last 3 million years. And this is carrying the world's climate into a level not seen any time during the life of our species. And the consequences are already absolutely dramatic. This is New York's finest. Police cars floating down 10th Street in Lower Manhattan during Superstorm Sandy. We learned that this very sophisticated city of ours in New York City could not get the lights on for weeks afterward in many places. We learned that we had forgotten that you do not put backup generators in the basements of hospitals because they flood. A similar lesson that was learned at Fukushima with the backup of a nuclear reactor safety system in lower levels subject to flooding. We are learning that the resultant aerosols of coal burning have claimed millions of lives worldwide. If you think nuclear is dangerous, the estimate is fewer than 100 deaths from release of nuclear radiation, but the deaths from coal-fired power plants are well over 1.5 million worldwide. And we see this in China these days. The air is absolutely unacceptable. The advice in early January was stop breathing. Next week you can breathe again, because this was like being in the intensity, I'm told, of 30 airport smoking lounges, all stuffed together in one room. So far above safety levels that many major companies just decamped, said, we're not going to keep our children in Beijing anymore. It's too dangerous. And of course, we have droughts, massive heat waves. This is in Brazil, where I was a few weeks ago in São Paulo state, a massive drought, water reservoirs at between 15 and 40% of normal. You might think the state would have sounded the alarm, but you can't do that just a few weeks before the World Cup. And so they've sounded no alarm at all. And heaven knows after the World Cup there'll be a national election. I don't know what they're doing exactly, but they are running out of water. And there are droughts in Sumatra these weeks that are spreading. This is what nitrogen flux really means. There are about 150 estuaries around the world now with massive algal blooms. I like to say that this is also my poster for bad parenting. Do not put your child in an algal bloom. Just a tip. There's a lot of nutrients in that water. You don't want your child in that coastal waterway. And extreme storms and flooding. I could have added the massive destruction in Serbia that has taken place in the last 72 hours. I got a kind of SOS from a Serbian leader last night. Please help to bring world attention to an unprecedented disaster. They have had floods that they have never seen before, not one in a century, but never seen before in the last week, and it has destroyed the farmlands, the soils, the infrastructure, and it's come out of the blue, and it's of course also led to massive numbers of dead and massive displacement. Typhoon Haiyan, you'll recall, was the strongest tropical cyclone in measurement record when it hit the Philippines, landfalling tropical cyclone, I should say, and great devastation. The drought in Syria that lasted almost 10 years was a major factor in the onset of the massive violence in Syria. You had large population movements that were escaping prolonged drought. Populations of refugees circled old cities, sectarian unrest and unhappiness with the government's inability to address this crisis unfolded. Then usually, as is usually the case, there was a spark. In this case, it was the so-called Arab Spring spark from Tunisia and Egypt. Violence, or not violence, unrest and protest started. The government cracked down with incredible brutality. And then, as usual, big powers, including the United States, started to meddle and said, okay, this government has to go. I don't believe in one government telling another government it has to go. It usually ends very badly. And in fact, there was a huge influx of arms, and now more than 130,000 Syrians are dead. And the fact of the matter is that it started with mega drought. We're just not good at handling these kinds of shocks. Some economists say, don't exaggerate, you know, we manage very well, but we actually very often manage to make bad much, much worse with a collapse of systems and a descent into violence and destruction. And Australia, of course, you know very well, this continent is extraordinarily vulnerable to these changes and is absolutely vividly experiencing these extreme events. And I understand the government says, well, it's always experienced extreme events, but never at the intensity and frequency that is being experienced in Australia in recent years. Whether it's massive forest fires associated with extreme dry conditions or massive flooding, as in Queensland last year, or massive heat waves as we observed during the Australian Open, with the world watching temperature levels that were simply unbelievable coming from this intense heat wave. And the fact of the matter is, just a little bit of alert, though everything is uncertain and probabilistic, now most models are suggesting that we are going to tip into an El Nino state of the Pacific this year. It's put at about 70%. At least one major scientific group, the Potsdam Institute of Climate, is calling this likely a mega El Nino. The predictability of that is much less, so this is not really a forecast but a warning. And we know that Australia is extraordinarily vulnerable to El Ninos, massive disruption of climate systems throughout the continent, all over the country, with drying and heat waves and other shocks, and all over the tropical and subtropical world, indeed. We would get upheavals. You know, during the period since the last big El Nino, which was 1998 globally, the average temperature increase year by year of global warming has been about half of what it had been in the preceding decade. It's so-called pause of warming. It's not really a pause, but a slower rate of year-to-year mean temperature increase. But this is clearly related to the El Nino, La Nina state of the Pacific, which has been basically a La Nina state, perhaps related to what's also hypothesized as a decadal variation, something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. What is likely to be the case that the next big El Nino, whether it's this one or sometime soon, will push world temperatures to record levels, because El Ninos are associated not just with shifts of precipitation and warming of the eastern Pacific, but are associated with global interannual changes of temperature. And this is likely to create by far a record of the hottest years, and I think it will also change global politics because it will be a massive disruption when it occurs. This isn't a hope, it's a reality. We will have this, whether it's this year or sometime soon, and it will also change how we understand what's happening. That's our reality, ladies and gentlemen. It's complicated. It's complicated because we are heirs to this phenomenal capacity to fight poverty, to make directed technological change, and yet we're living in a time of upheaval. geopolitical, social, institutional, economic, labor, and a collision course with the planet. And sustainable development is a concept. It actually means two things. One is it's an analytical way of viewing the world. From a scholarly point of view, sustainable development means an integrated systems approach to the dynamics of multiple highly nonlinear systems: economic, technological, environmental, social, and geopolitical. So it's an interdisciplinary enterprise that tries to understand the world through systems dynamics, integrating many biophysical and social systems dynamics. From a normative point of view, it is an ethical principle, I would say, that says that we aim for a society that is properly balanced between economic, social, and environmental objectives. Clearly, this is a crisis that we're grappling with inside Australia today, in the United States, and at a global scale. How to balance the economic, the social, and the environmental. Not just to balance them, but to view them in a holistic and an integrated way. That's the aim of sustainable development. Now, I mentioned that the Earth Summit had set 3 big treaties on climate change, biodiversity, and desertification in 1992. 20 years later, when the governments got together to review the progress of the 3 treaties, Nature magazine, one of the 2 premier scientific weeklies in the world, gave a report card of those 3 treaties. It was a rather straightforward report card: F, F, and F. Not one of them has been implemented. We lost 20 years' time. We approached the planetary boundaries or exceeded the planetary boundaries during that period. So when the world's governments got together in 2012, once again at Rio, it was a rather forlorn meeting. And in a way, it was really shocking politically for me, because in 1992, almost impossible for me to imagine, a U.S. Republican president had actually gone, George Herbert Walker Bush Sr., and had actually signed 3 treaties. And in 2012, a Democratic Party president, ostensibly the environmental side of our political spectrum, didn't even dare to go, and worked overtime to make sure that no one dreamt of a new treaty. Of course, it was a defensive gesture, but it shows how politics has changed. That the president didn't want to be seen anywhere near the UN. That's what our right wing means right now. It's absolutely unbelievable. In the U.S., we passed a disabilities law, which is a wonderful law, for access for disabled people. The UN thought it was such a wonderful law, they made it into a treaty. When it came back for ratification in the Senate, the U.S. Senate rejected the treaty, even though it was their own law, because if the UN agreed, it must be bad. I kid you not. We're one of the only 3 countries in the world not to have ratified the Convention of Rights of the Children. Our other partners in this are South Sudan and Somalia. A little kooky, and by the way, you depend on that country for your security, you think. Be careful. Really. The world's changing, and the world's odd, and we have to get our politics right and better. The good thing that came out of the Rio Plus 20, the major pivotal idea, was to try to bring the issue of sustainable development to the broad public worldwide. The treaty room, the closed room of the diplomats had not worked. It was not sufficient. Mind you, nothing's wrong with those treaties. They're excellent documents, very well crafted and well negotiated, but they were not implemented. And so the idea at Rio Plus 20 was, let's have goals for the public worldwide. Goals that all of us can embrace, teach, understand, promote, and act upon. Goals that are goals for nations, goals that are goals for great cities like Melbourne. And the great outcome of Rio Plus 20 was to call for Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, as the successor to the anti-poverty MDGs. But this time with the Sustainable Development Goals being universal objectives, not just for poor countries, but for all of us, because we all need it. We all need that holistic approach to our politics and to our lives and to our institutions. And goals not only about the economy and poverty, but goals that embrace social inclusion, goals of equality, goals of fairness and human rights, and goals of environmental sustainability. And the world governments are in the process of negotiating these goals now. And they've set a timeline to adopt the SDGs in September 2015. It's one of those high-level objectives that I mentioned at the very beginning. I agree, again, with what President Kennedy said. He's a great source of learning about leadership. And he talked about the leadership that can come through goal setting. He said, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. And that's what the SDGs can do. They can help make sustainable development seem more manageable, more concrete, more specific, more related to our needs and our children's needs. And by bringing knowledge to bear on these goals, we can also show that they are achievable, and in that way give people hope and help a whole world to move irresistibly towards shared objectives. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon honored me and gave all of us a great opportunity by calling for a global network, which he's asked me to help organize, to provide a global knowledge base for putting these SDGs into implementation. And I'm thrilled to be working with John Thwaites and with Monash University and with the universities around Australia in establishing this Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And Bob Watson, great scientist, statesman sitting in front of me, who has been a great guru for all of us on all of this since the beginning of trying to quantify and define the real challenges we face on climate change, on agriculture, and in so many other areas, has done a wonderful process led with Dave Griggs at Monash of defining how these goals can work for a country like Australia. And I was thrilled yesterday to be at a meeting to see how this is working. It's path-breaking, because what Australia is doing is going to be taken up all over the world as showing that these are goals truly universalizable. Let me say that. They can be made universal, they can be made applicable, they can be defined to the real needs and real conditions of every country. And I just want to congratulate you for that phenomenal leadership. Now, we have recommended a series of goals, and as this SDSN globally and the Australian Monash project has taken a list and defined it appropriately for Australia's needs. Just to say at the global level, the kind of goals that will be set, surely SDG number 1 is going to be calling for ending extreme poverty. And goal number 10 will be about good global governance. It's everything in between that is being refined and debated right now. And we're trying to get this down to a manageable number. When this was first opened up and countries were asked about the goals that they would like, the first list had 240 goals on them. And I have advocated, you might call it Moses' rule, that if you can put the big commandments on 2 tablets, 10 goals, we could probably put the SDGs on the same list as well. And this is what I'm calling, or I'm hoping for in the global processes right now. Let's make a list that's understandable, that can be memorized by every young student, and that can be taken as a guidepost and rallying cry for all of us. Surely it will include goals about education, social inclusion, health, sustainable agriculture, and one of the goals that we're absolutely pushing and is working, it's going to be on the list, is cities, sustainable cities. And just as we heard the counselor introduce Melbourne as it is a most remarkable, wonderful place, as a city that's taken up sustainable development at the very core. I hope that this C40 process and the idea of sustainable development being scaled at the urban scale will be taken up by thousands of cities around the world as a great way to proceed. Sustainable energy and climate change, sustainable biodiversity, and good governance. Let me talk about 2 very specific challenges in closing in the Australian context. First, to finish the job of ending extreme poverty. We're close. It's within reach. Of course, it will never stick if climate change runs out of control, mind you. But we're close to being able to make the directed investments to help today's poorest of the poor gain the health, the skills, the nutrition, the basic infrastructure to be able to break free of extreme poverty. And when you consider the least developed countries, of course, there are many members of that group that are in your neighborhood that need your help. There are many countries in Southeast Asia still, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and there are many countries in sub-Saharan Africa that would benefit tremendously from Australia's knowledge, and where many of your leading companies like BHP are operating and have an enormous positive potential role to play. And yet the reality is this right now. Australia's turned in the wrong direction recently, with the commitment of all countries to reach 0.7 of all donor countries. Australia peaked in its aid levels back in around 2011-12 at half of the global mark, mind you, not even beyond that. And now your government is saying you can't afford it. You can't afford 0.7% of national income of one of the richest, most prosperous places on the entire planet. I don't buy it for a moment. Of course you can afford it. And yet, and please compare this graph with this graph. This is the UK. Conservative government, many years of an austerity budget, and yet when that government came in, they said they would protect the target, not even the level, the target of 0.7 in the midst of an austerity drive. That is good values. That makes sense for the UK and for Australia and for all of us. In the midst of an austerity budget, David Cameron and Chancellor George Osborne and the entire coalition government succeeded in achieving the 0.7% of GDP global goal. They've done it. And I commend it to your foreign minister and I commend to your government, look at your counterpart. What's happening in the UK? Because yes, they want to balance the budget too. Yes, they have austerity measures. But as David Cameron said, you do not balance a budget on the backs of the world's poorest people. And we expect better of Australia. Oops, second piece of bad news. One more message among friends. Climate change is no joke. It's no game, except apparently to Rupert Murdoch. It's the real thing. No government has the right to be ignorant. No government has the right to be in denial. No government has the right to say, it's not our priority right now. No government has the right to put up tiny, insignificant steps to a great global challenge. No government, not my own, not yours, not any government. We are really at the end of the tether on climate change. Remember that in the Framework Convention, the world agreed, all the signatories, to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. We already have it, ladies and gentlemen. In 2010, as a fallback, the world's government said we will not allow the mean temperature to rise above 2 degrees centigrade, higher than the pre-industrial level. Now, that's a dangerous level already. That's way outside the Holocene level. That's already potentially setting off massive feedbacks and amplifiers. But it's a line, and it's agreed. And at least we have to live within that line. And to do so, we will need a dramatic change at a global scale, illustrated by this graphic from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are 4 reference pathways, so-called reference concentration pathways of different emission levels of carbon dioxide. The one at the top is the business as usual. The one at the bottom is the one consistent with 2 degrees centigrade. On the vertical axis is billions of tons of carbon emitted. If you want to convert that to CO2, which is more familiar, you multiply by the ratio of the atomic weight of CO2 to carbon, 3.667. We're emitting right now about 10 billion tons carbon per year, or about 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide worldwide per year. That's at the 2010 level, right about here. If we're going to hold to the 2-degree level, we have to make a dramatic turn down to around here, which comes to approximately 15 billion tons of carbon dioxide in the year 2050. In other words, roughly a 60% reduction from today in a world economy that will have 40% more people and perhaps a doubling or tripling of the per capita income level. The only way this can be achieved is through a deep transformation of our energy system. Nothing superficial will be good enough. This is not a matter of small changes of behavior. It's not even a matter of adding more solar panels here and there. It is a matter of stopping the massive emissions from the fossil fuels and doing that at a scale that matters. To do that requires a huge transformation, and it requires leaving a lot of the fossil fuels under the ground or putting them back under the ground if one possible technology of carbon capture and sequestration proves to be feasible at large scale. Roughly speaking, we have 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide left that can be emitted without breaching the 2 degrees barrier. but we're emitting at about 35 billion tons per year. We have less than 30 years at today's rate before we absolutely pass that boundary. And that boundary is only good with 2/3 probability. We have a likelihood, even with that boundary, of going above 2 degrees centigrade of roughly 1/3 according to the climate models. So we have under 30 years at the current rate of emission, but the rate of emission is rising sharply. And so to live within the carbon budget, we need that dramatic downturn. And that dramatic downturn means that roughly we can use only 1/3 of the proved fossil fuel reserves that exist of the coal, oil, and gas. The rest has to stay underground or has to be captured and sequestered at massive scale. And yet, despite this, the industry is out spending hundreds of billions of dollars of new exploration. For what? To double down on wrecking the planet? What is all of that for when we already have more than enough discovered, proved reserves than we can use? The truth of the matter is our governments have not thought through this with any clarity. And any country like Australia or the United States or Canada is really in the grips of its energy industry, its fossil fuel industry. And this impedes clear thinking, frankly. And so we're run half the time literally from Texas, and the other half the time only seemingly from Texas. Canada's run full-time from Alberta these days, from its oil sands. Australia's run by its industry. But it makes no sense, not only for our destruction, but for the future of all of our countries. This will not be allowed to continue. It will stop. The question is whether it stops through a properly foreseen transition which preserves our well-being, or whether it stops through upheaval, through massive climate disruption, and through a political backlash that hits at some unpredictable time. Of course, what we want is the lead time, the foresight, the smarts to say we can move to a safe energy system. I don't know the future of coal, which is so important for this country, but I do know that if there is to be a future of coal, for example, then carbon capture and sequestration better work. And to find out whether it works, you need a massive research and development program to find out whether it works. It makes no sense for Australia to just stumble into the future until something happens. And so when I met with the foreign minister, I said the one thing surely this government can do is to help bring together Canada, Australia, the United States, China, India, to really demonstrate this technology. Maybe it will work. Maybe it can work at a large scale. Wonderful. I'd like nothing more. Then we have infrastructure already in place for an energy future. Nothing's wrong with fossil fuel if it can be made to work safely. But that requires technologies that are pre-commercial, unproved, and not being deployed right now. That has to be tested. And that requires an organized scientific and technological effort, bringing together engineering, geology, public policy on a massive scale for all of the major coal-burning countries of the world. Australia is not exactly turning the curve down yet. And it can't run away. It's the 8th largest emitting country in the world, and it's the 4th largest coal reserve owning country in the world. And so you can't say we're just 23 million people. Australia is one of the decisive countries for the future of the planet. In fact, you can say it's the US, EU, China, India, Russia, Australia, Canada, and the Gulf. This is where the future of the world's going to be decided with respect to climate change. The other 170 or so countries, in this sense, are watching. They don't own the reserves. It's the countries with the reserves that are going to shape the future of the planet. So we need massive technological change. And I'm told we don't have time to discuss it because I have rambled on and on. But we need to decarbonize the energy system. I'll give a tip. Don't be absolutely against nuclear power. You have to solve the carbon budget. If you can do it without nuclear, fine. But if you need to do it, and if the only way to do it is with nuclear power, understand that that is a greatly preferred option to the status quo. We have to have serious planning. We have to have a serious view of staying within the global carbon budget. And as I've indicated, we need to make a massive technological effort in key areas if we're going to find our way forward. We need to think, and we need to think in an organized and planned direction for the safety of the planet. And when we do so, wonderful things can happen. And mind you, Moore's Law did not just continue because of companies taking actions. It continued because the industry at the industry scale has had a roadmap backed by tremendous amounts of public financing as well to continue the advances in information technology to make it possible for Moore's Law to continue. And the same is true on the other technologies that we need. So this is an audience filled with the young people that are going to have to make this happen. This is, in my opinion, the defining challenge of the coming generation. There's no way around it. You can't fake nature. You can't spin nature. It doesn't really matter what the Wall Street Journal writes every day from nature's point of view. Nature has told us the truth, and we have to respond to it. And I'll close with one more wise word of John F. Kennedy. You know, he championed goal setting, and he went after great goals. One of those goals was negotiating peace with the Soviet Union in 1963, just months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, we can't go on this way. And he successfully negotiated the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty because he felt that he and his counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, had just lived through something that humanity had never lived before, almost the destruction of the species, and that both sides had to pull back from the brink. And it was in that context he talked about setting the goal clearly and making it seem manageable and less remote, that peace was possible. The other great goal, of course, that President Kennedy set for America was to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely to Earth before the end of the decade. That was the defining challenge of my youth, my early years. Listening by the radio originally at Cape Canaveral to the first launch of Alan Shepard in the Mercury missions all the way through Gemini and the Apollo mission that carried Neil Armstrong to the moon. And when President Kennedy called on the American people in 1961 to do this, there was no plan for it yet. This is amazing. It took NASA another 18 months to settle on the basic three-part strategy of Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo with the lunar module and all the rest to actually make this. The engineers came through. It was a public-private partnership of an astounding capacity and spirit and verve. And of course, it did work before the end of the decade. And President Kennedy called it before there was a plan, and he challenged the country, and he said, we can do it. And in one of his most wonderful speeches, which I commend to you, it's on the internet, he gave a talk in Rice University in a big stadium in a wonderful occasion talking about the moonshot. And he made these words which resonate for us today. He said, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too. And for all of us, let's win the challenge of sustainable development." Thank you very much.